The sea roared like a beast, swallowing the screams of two brothers as they plummeted from the cliff. Their mother's silhouette stood frozen against the storm, her hands trembling, her heart a shattered mirror reflecting years of pain, fear, and desperate love. No one in the small coastal town of Havens Inn would ever forget that night or the impossible miracle that followed. Elliot and Caleb, inseparable since childhood, had always been each other's anchor in a world that judged them too harshly. Growing up in a conservative fishing village on the Maine coast, they learned early to hide their truth. Elliot, the elder at 22, was firebolt, unapologetic, with a laugh that could light up the darkest room. Caleb, 2 years younger, was water gentle, introspective, with eyes that held secrets too heavy for his quiet soul. They were brothers, but they were also something more, something the town could never understand. Their love, a forbidden flame, burned in stolen glances and whispered promises under the stars. Their mother, Margaret, was a woman carved from the rugged cliffs themselves, unyielding, devout, and fiercely protective. She loved her sons, but her faith was a cage, its bars forged from sermons that branded their bond to sin. When whispers of their relationship spread through Havens End, carried by cruel tongues in the church pews, Margaret's world began to crumble. The town's judgment was relentless, and her own heart waged war between love for her boys and fear of divine retribution. That night, under a sky torn apart by lightning, Margaret made a choice no mother should face. She drove Elliot and Caleb to the cliffs, her hands shaking on the wheel, tears blurring her vision. "You can't live like this," she sobbed, her voice breaking. "I'm saving you from yourselves." The brothers clung to each other, their faces pale but defiant, as she forced them toward the edge. "God will forgive you," she whispered, and with a final, anguished push, she sent them into the abyss. The town awoke to the news the next morning. Margaret had confessed, her voice hollow as she knelt in the church, begging for absolution. The sea had claimed her sons, and Havens Inn mourned, though some whispered they'd gotten what they deserved. But the story didn't end there. Something unnatural stirred in the depths, something that defied the laws of life and death. Elliot woke first, gasping for air that shouldn't exist. His body was weightless, suspended in a shimmering void where the ocean's roar was a distant hum. Beside him, Caleb floated, his eyes wide with wonder. They weren't deader if they were. Death was nothing like they'd been taught. The water around them pulsed with light, warm and alive, as if the sea itself had cradled them, refusing to let them go. A voice, not human but resonant with love, whispered through the currents, "You are not forsaken." They emerged on a hidden shore, miles from Havens End, their clothes soaked but their bodies unharmed. The rainbow that arched across the sky felt like a promise, a sign that their love was not a curse but a gift. Yet even as they held each other, trembling with relief, they knew their journey was far from over. The sea had spared them, but their mother's act and the town's hatred loomed like storm clouds on the horizon. Elliot's fist clenched as he stared at the ocean. "We can't go back," he said, his voice raw. "Not yet." Caleb nodded, his hand tightening around his brother's. They had been given a second chance. But for what? To hide again? To fight? Or to find a place where their love could exist without fear? The days that followed were a blur of survival and discovery. They found refuge in a deserted fisherman's shack, its walls weathered but sturdy. Inside, they pieced together their new reality. The sea had changed them. Elliot's touch sparked faint glimmers of light, and Caleb's dreams were filled with visions of the ocean's depths, as if it were speaking to him. They didn't understand it, but they felt it. Something greater than themselves had intervened, and it wasn't done with them yet. Haven's End, meanwhile, was unraveling. Margaret's confession had split the town. Some called her a monster, others a martyr. The church held vigils, but the air was thick with guilt and doubt. Rumors began to spread. Fishermen swore they saw lights dancing on the waves, and children whispered of figures walking the shore at dawn. The town that had condemned the brothers now faced a reckoning, as if the sea itself demanded justice. Elliot and Caleb knew they couldn't stay hidden forever. Their mother's act, born of pain and misguided love, had set something in motion. They had to confront her, the town, and the truth of who they were. But first, they needed answers. What was the force that had saved them? And why had it chosen them? As they sat by the shack's flickering fire, Caleb traced a finger along Elliot's palm, sparking a tiny glow. "Whatever this is," Caleb whispered, "it's ours. And it's beautiful." The shack became their sanctuary, a fragile bubble shielding Elliot and Caleb from the world that had rejected them. Each morning, they woke to the sea's song, a low hum that seemed to pulse through their veins. Elliot, ever the protector, scoured the coastline for food clams buried in the sand, berries from wild bushes, while Caleb sat cross-legged, sketching the visions that haunted his dreams. His pencil traced coral spires and glowing currents, images that felt like memories of a place they'd never been. "We're different now," Caleb said one evening, his voice soft as he showed Elliot a drawing of two figures wreathed in light. "The sea didn't just save us. It marked us." Elliot frowned, his fingers brushing the faint scars on his wrists, scars that hadn't existed before that night. He didn't trust the ocean's gift. Not yet. "If it's a mark, it's a target," he said. "We need to know what it wants." Their search for answers led them to an old lighthouse, abandoned since a storm had shattered its beacon years ago. The keeper, a reclusive woman named Alma, was the town's outcast, whispered to be a witch who spoke to the sea. When they knocked on her door, she didn't flinch at their glowing scars or the way the air shimmered around them. "You've been touched," she said, her eyes sharp as she poured tea from a chipped pot. "The sea doesn't give without taking." Alma's words were cryptic but heavy with truth. She spoke of an ancient force in the ocean, older than the gods the town worshipped, a presence that chose its champions in times of great need. "It saw your love," she said, her gaze softening. "And it saw your pain. It gave you a purpose. But it won't be easy." Elliot's jaw tightened. "We didn't ask for this." Alma smiled, her teeth stained by years of solitude. "No one ever does." She gave them a map, hand-drawn on weathered parchment, marking a cove where the sea's power was strongest. "Find the heart of the tide," she said. "It'll show you why you're here." The brothers left with more questions than answers. But Alma's words lit a fire in Caleb. He felt the sea's call in his bones, a pull towards something greater than survival. Elliot, skeptical but loyal, followed because Caleb believed. The cove was a hidden gem, its entrance veiled by cliffs that seemed to part only for them. The water there glowed faintly, even in daylight. And when Caleb dipped his hand in, the light surged, wrapping around his arm like a living thing. He gasped, his eyes wide with awe. "It's alive," he whispered. Elliot pulled him back, fear flashing across his face. "Alive or not, we don't know what it wants with us." That night, Caleb's dreams were vivid. He saw their mother, her face twisted with grief, standing on the cliff. But instead of pushing them, she reached out, her hands glowing with the same light that marked her son's. He woke with a start, his heart pounding. "She's part of this," he told Elliot. "She didn't just try to kill us. She started something." Elliot's eyes darkened. "She doesn't get a pass for what she did." Back in Haven's End, Margaret was unraveling. She hadn't slept since the night she'd confessed, her dreams haunted by her son's faces. The town's judgment was merciless. Some spat at her in the streets. Others prayed for her soul. But the strangest thing was the sea. Fishermen reported their nets coming up empty, the waves colder than they should be. At night, lights danced on the horizon, and the church's pastor whispered of curses. Margaret felt it too, a pull toward the ocean, as if it were calling her to answer for her sins. She began walking the cliffs at dawn, searching for signs of her boys. Guilt gnawed at her, but so did a flicker of hope. What if they weren't gone? What if the sea had spared them, as it had spared others in the old stories her grandmother used to tell? She clung to that thought, even as the town turned its back on her. Elliot and Caleb, meanwhile, returned to the cove daily, testing the limits of their strange new gifts. Elliot's touch could summon light, bright enough to blind, while Caleb's visions grew clearer, showing glimpses of a world beneath the waves, city of coral and light, where love was not judged but celebrated. "This is why we're here," Caleb said, his voice trembling with conviction. "To show them we're not wrong. To show her." But Elliot wasn't so sure. The sea's power felt like a chain, binding them to a purpose they didn't fully understand. And as they stood at the cove's edge, a shadow moved in the distancia, a figure watching from the cliffs. It wasn't Alma. It was someone from Haven's End, someone who knew they were alive. The figure on the cliff was Pastor John, Haven's End's moral compass and Margaret's confidant. His eyes, sharp as the gulls circling above, locked onto Elliot and Caleb. He'd heard the rumors of lights on the water, of the brothers' survival, and now he had proof. His heart raced not with relief, but with fear. To him, their return was not a miracle but a defiance of God's will. He turned back toward the town, his mind set on rallying the faithful. Elliot's instincts screamed danger. "We've been seen," he said, pulling Caleb behind a boulder. Caleb's face paled, but his eyes burned with resolve. "We can't keep running. If the sea chose us, we have to face them." Elliot's jaw clenched. He wanted to protect Caleb, to shield him from the town's venom. But he knew his brother was right. Hiding wasn't freedom, it was just another cage. They returned to the shack, packing what little they had. The map from Alma lay open on the table, its lines glowing faintly under Caleb's touch. "The heart of the tide," Caleb murmured, tracing the cove's outline. "If we find it, we'll know what to do." Elliot nodded, though doubt gnawed at him. What if the sea's gift was a trap? What if it demanded more than they could give? Their journey to the cove was tense, the air heavy with the promise of another storm. When they arrived, the water was restless, its glow pulsing like a heartbeat. Caleb knelt at the edge, letting the waves lap over his hands. The light surged again, brighter this time, and he gasped as a vision flooded his mind, a woman. Not their mother, but ancient and radiant, her body woven from coral and starlight. "You are my voice," she said, her words echoing in his chest. "Speak for those who cannot." Elliot watched, his heart pounding as Caleb's eyes glowed with the same light as the water. "What did you see?" he demanded, pulling Caleb to his feet. Caleb's voice trembled as he recounted the vision. The woman's words. "The city beneath the waves. She wants us to change things. To show the world that love like ours isn't wrong." Elliot's laugh was bitter. "The world. We can't even change Haven's End." But Caleb's conviction was unshakable. He believed the sea had spared them for a reason, that their love was a beacon meant to shine beyond the cliffs. Elliot, torn between fear and loyalty, agreed to follow the map's path deeper into the cove. They waded into the water, the light wrapping around them like a second skin. Beneath the surface, the ocean opened like a cathedral, its depths alive with colors no human eye should see. In Haven's End, Pastor John wasted no time. He gathered the townsfolk in the church, his voice thundering with righteous fury. "The brothers have returned, defying the Lord's judgment," he declared. "They are an affront to nature, a curse upon our town." Some nodded, their faces tight with fear, but others hesitated. A young fisherman, Thomas, spoke up, his voice shaking. "What if it's a miracle? What if the sea spared them for a reason?" The room erupted in shouts, division cracking the town's fragile unity. Margaret, standing at the back, felt her heart twist. She hadn't dared hope her sons were alive, but now the possibility burned through her. She slipped out of the church, her feet carrying her to the cliffs. The sea was calling her again, its voice louder now, urging her to face what she'd done. At the cove, Elliot and Caleb found the heart of the Tidea, massive crystal pulsing with light, embedded in the ocean floor. When Caleb touched it, the water erupted in a symphony of colors, and his mind filled with images of their past, their first kiss under the pier, the nights they'd hidden from their mother's gaze, the pain of living in shadows. The crystal showed them a future, to a world where they could walk hand in hand without fear. But the vision came with a warning. Their path would be fraught with danger. The town was coming for them, led by Pastor John's zeal. The sea's power could protect them, but only if they embraced it fully. "What does that mean?" Elliot asked, his voice hoarse. Caleb shook his head, unsure, but the crystal's light seemed to seep into their skin, making their scars glow brighter. As they surfaced, the storm broke overhead, rain lashing the cove. In the distance, torches flickered past Pastor John and his followers were closing in. Elliot grabbed Caleb's hand, his eyes fierce. "Whatever happens, we face it together." Caleb nodded, his heart steady despite the fear. The sea had given them a second chance, and they would fight for it. The torches grew closer, their flames spitting against the rain. Pastor John led the group, his face carved with righteous certainty, a Bible clutched in one hand, a fishing spear in the other. Behind him, a dozen townsfolk followed, their eyes a mix of fear and fervor. Elliot and Caleb stood at the cove's edge, the heart of the tide's light still pulsing faintly in their veins. The sea roared behind them, as if daring the mob to approach. "We don't want to hurt you," Elliot shouted, his voice cutting through the storm. "Just let us live." But Pastor John's gaze was unyielding. "You defy God's will," he bellowed. "The sea should have taken you." Caleb stepped forward, his scars glowing brighter, his voice steady. "The sea didn't take us. It chose us. Why can't you see that?" The crowd faltered, some lowering their torches. Thomas, the young fisherman, pushed to the front, his face torn. "I knew you both," he said. "You're not evil. But this light, this power, it's not natural." Caleb's eyes softened. "Love isn't evil, Thomas. The sea saw that. Why can't you?" Before Thomas could respond, Pastor John lunged, his spear aimed at Caleb. Elliot moved faster, his hand flaring with light as he shoved the pastor back. The crowd gasped, some stumbling in fear, others raising their weapons. The brothers stood back to back, the sea's energy surging through them. "We don't want to fight," Elliot yelled, but the mob's anger was a tide of its own. Margaret, hidden behind a rock, watched in horror. She'd followed the torches, driven by the sea's pull and her own desperate hope. Seeing her sons alive, glowing with an otherworldly light, shattered something inside her. She stepped into the open, her voice raw. "Stop," she cried. "They're my boys." The crowd froze, Pastor John's spear still raised. "Margaret," he growled, "you cast them out. Don't falter now." But Margaret's eyes were on her sons. "I was wrong," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I thought I was saving you, but I was wrong." Elliot's face hardened, but Caleb reached for her, his hand trembling. "Mom," he said, his voice breaking. "Why?" Before she could answer, a wave crashed over the cove, unnatural in its force, knocking the mob back. The sea was intervening, its light flaring around the brothers. Pastor John screamed, "This is the devil's work." But Thomas grabbed his arm, pulling him away. "Enough," Thomas shouted. "We're tearing ourselves apart." The crowd hesitated, fear overtaking their rage. The brothers and Margaret fled deeper into the cove, the sea's light shielding them. They collapsed in a hidden alcove, panting, the glow fading from their skin. Margaret sobbed, reaching for her sons. But Elliot pulled away. "You don't get to touch us," he said, his voice cold. Caleb, torn, placed a hand on Elliot's shoulder. "She's here now. Elle. She's trying." Margaret's story poured out her fear, her faith, the sermons that had poisoned her mind. She believed she was saving their souls, but the sea's call had awakened her to her mistake. "I don't understand what's happening to you," she said, "but I know I was wrong to hurt you." Caleb's eyes filled with tears, but Elliot's remained hard. "Words don't undo what you did," he said. The alcove grew quiet, the storm outside softening. Caleb touched the walls, where faint carvings glowed symbols like those in his dreams. "The sea's been guiding us," he said. It wants us to heal. Not just ourselves, but everyone. Elliot scoffed. Heal them. After what they've done. But Caleb's gaze was steady. If we don't, who will? They spent the night in the alcove, guarded by the sea's strange power. Margaret stayed, though Elliot kept his distance. At dawn, Caleb woke to a new vision, the Coral City, now filled with people Haven's End. Transformed, its streets alive with acceptance. He told Elliot, who shook his head. A dream's not a plan. But Caleb's hope was infectious, and Elliot felt it stirring in him, too. They knew the town wouldn't stop hunting them. Pastor John's influence was too strong, and fear ran deep. But the heart of the tide had shown them a purposito challenge the hatred that had nearly destroyed them. As they stepped out into the morning light, the sea whispered again, "Be my voice." Dawn broke over Haven's End, painting the cliffs in hues of gold and pink. But the town was far from peaceful. Pastor John's crusade had ignited a fire, and by midday, search parties scoured the coast, armed with fear and makeshift weapons. Elliot and Caleb, hidden in the alcove with Margaret, knew time was running out. The sea's power had protected them, but it couldn't shield them forever, not unless they understood its purpose. Caleb's visions were growing stronger, each one a piece of a puzzle. He saw the Coral City again, its spires glowing under a sky where the rainbow never faded. But now, faces appeared: Thomas, Alma, even Pastor John. Their expressions softened by understanding. It's not just about us, Caleb said, his voice urgent. The sea wants to change them, too. Elliot's eyes narrowed. Change them. They tried to kill us. Margaret, sitting quietly, flinched at his words. She spoke up, her voice fragile but determined. I can help. I can talk to them. Make them see. Elliot's laugh was sharp. You think they'll listen to you now? After what you did? Caleb placed a hand on his brother's arm. She's trying. We need her. Elliot pulled away, but the fight in him wavered. He hated her, but he loved her. To a knot he couldn't untangle. They decided to return to the heart of the tide, hoping it would reveal more. The cove was quiet, the water calm but alive with light. Caleb waded in, the glow wrapping around him like a lover's embrace. This time, Elliot followed, his fear outweighed by his need to protect Caleb. The crystal pulsed, and their minds filled with a shared vision, the town square, filled with people, their hands joined in a circle, the sea's light flowing through them. At its center stood the brothers, their love a beacon that silenced judgment. The vision faded, leaving them breathless. It's a call to action, Caleb said. We have to go back to Haven's End. We have to show them. Elliot's face darkened. Show them what? That we're freaks now. But Caleb's eyes were fierce. That we're human. That love isn't a sin. Margaret agreed to go first, to speak to the town and soften their hearts. She left the cove, her steps heavy with guilt but fueled by hope. In Haven's End, she found Thomas at the docks, his face weary from the night's chaos. They're alive, she told him, her voice steady. And they're not what you think. Please, help me stop this madness. Thomas hesitated, then nodded. He'd seen the brother's light, felt its warmth. Maybe it wasn't a curse. By evening, Margaret and Thomas gathered a small group doubters, outcasts, and those tired of Pastor John's fire. They met in Alma's lighthouse, where the old woman listened, her eyes gleaming. "The sea's been waiting for this," she said, handing Margaret a pendant carved with the same symbols as the cove's walls. "Wear it. It'll protect you." Meanwhile, Elliot and Caleb prepared to face the town. The sea's power was stronger now, their scars glowing even in daylight. Elliot's touch could summon bursts of light, bright enough to stun, while Caleb's visions guided their steps. They knew the risk. Pastor John's mob was relentless, but they also knew the sea had chosen them for this moment. As night fell, they approached Haven's End, the town square lit by torches. Pastor John stood at its center, preaching of judgment and cleansing. But Margaret stepped forward, the pendant glowing faintly at her chest. "My sons are alive," she declared, her voice carrying over the crowd. "And they're not your enemy. I was wrong to fear their love. And so are you." The crowd murmured, some shouting in anger, others in confusion. Pastor John raised his spear, but Thomas stepped in front of him, his voice firm. "Let them speak." The brothers emerged from the shadows, their scars alight, their hands clasped. The crowd gasped, some falling to their knees, others backing away. Caleb spoke first, his voice clear and unwavering. "We love each other. That's not a sin, it's a gift. The sea saw it, and it brought us back. Why can't you?" Elliot stood beside him, his light flaring as a shield against the mob's anger. For a moment, the town was silent, the weight of their words sinking in. But Pastor John's voice cut through the quiet, venomous and unyielding. "This is blasphemy," he roared, raising his spear. The sea's light surged, and the ground trembled beneath their feet. The ground shook, a low rumble that sent torches tumbling and cracked the cobblestones in the town square. The sea's light flared around Elliot and Caleb, a radiant barrier that held the mob at bay. Pastor John's spear fell from his trembling hand, his face pale as he stared at the brothers. "What are you?" he whispered, his voice no longer righteous but fearful. Caleb stepped forward, his scars glowing like stars. "We're your neighbors," he said. "Your sons, your brothers. We're human, just like you." The crowd wavered, some weeping, others clutching their children close. Margaret stood beside her sons, the pendant at her chest pulsing in rhythm with their light. "I was wrong," she said again, her voice breaking. "I let fear blind me. Don't make the same mistake." Thomas rallied those who doubted Pastor John, forming a protective ring around the brothers. "Enough hate," he said, his voice steady. "Haven's End has torn itself apart for too long." But not everyone was swayed. A group of Pastor John's loyalists surged forward, their makeshift weapons raised. Elliot's light flared brighter, a warning, but he didn't strike. "We won't fight you," he said, "but we won't hide anymore." The standoff broke when Alma appeared, her frail frame silhouetted against the torchlight. She raised her hands, and the sea's hum filled the air, a sound that silenced the crowd. "The ocean has spoken," she said, her voice carrying an ancient weight. "These boys are its voice. Listen, or be lost." The loyalists hesitated, their resolve crumbling under the weight of her words and the sea's power. Pastor John, cornered by doubt, fell to his knees. "I thought I was doing God's will," he murmured, tears streaking his face. Caleb knelt beside him, his hand gentle on the pastor's shoulder. "God didn't make us to hate," he said. "He made us to love." The pastor's sob echoed in the quiet, a crack in the wall of his faith. The night ended without bloodshed, but the town was far from healed. The brothers and Margaret returned to the lighthouse with Alma, their bodies heavy with exhaustion but their hearts lighter. The sea's light had faded, but its presence lingered, a reminder of their purpose. "This isn't over," Elliot said, his voice low. "They'll come for us again." Caleb nodded, but his eyes were bright. "Then we'll keep showing them. We'll keep fighting." Margaret stayed silent, her hands clasped around the pendant. She'd begun to understand the sea's gift, not just to her sons, but to Hera a chance to atone, to rebuild what she'd broken. "I'll stand with you," she said, her voice firm. Elliot's gaze softened. "Just a fraction." "We'll see," he said, but there was hope in his tone, a spark that hadn't been there before. Over the next days, Haven's Inn began to shift. Thomas and his allies spread word of the brothers' survival, their light, their love. Some families opened their doors, offering food and shelter. Others clung to their fear. But the sea's presence was undeniable. Fish returned to the nets. The waves calmed, and the lights on the horizon grew brighter. Caleb's visions continued, showing glimpses of the coral city now filled with Haven's Inn's people. Their faces no longer twisted by judgment, but softened by acceptance. He shared these with Elliot, who began to believe, not just in the sea, but in themselves. They started meeting with townsfolk in secret, sharing their story, their light, their love. Each conversation was a step toward change, a crack in the town's armor of fear. Alma taught them to harness the sea's power, to channel its light into acts of healing. Elliot's touch soothed burns and cuts, while Caleb's visions guided lost fishermen home. The brothers became a quiet legend, their presence a challenge to the town's old ways. But Pastor John, though shaken, was regrouping, whispering to his loyalists of a final reckoning. One evening, as the brothers stood on the cliffs, the sea whispered again, "The tide turns. But the storm is not over." Caleb looked at Elliot, his hand warm in his brother's. "We're ready," he said. Elliot squeezed his hand, his heart steady. "Together," he said. The rainbow above them burned brighter, a promise of what could be. The tide of change was slow but relentless. Haven's Inn began to fracture along new lines, not between faith and doubt, but between fear and hope. Families who'd once shunned the brothers now left offerings at the lighthouse. Fish, bread, handwritten notes of apology. Thomas became their voice in the town, speaking of the brothers' light, their survival, their love. But Pastor John's loyalists grew bolder, their whispers turning to plans. They saw the sea's miracles as a threat, a challenge to their world. Elliot and Caleb spent their days strengthening their bond with the sea. At the cove, they practiced with the heart of the tide, its light teaching them to weave their gifts into something greater. Elliot's bursts of light could now calm a storm, while Caleb's visions revealed paths to peace, small acts that could sway hearts. "We're not just fighting for us," Caleb said, his eyes bright with purpose. We're fighting for everyone who's been told their love is wrong. Margaret worked tirelessly, speaking to anyone who would listen. She stood in the market, her voice raw but unwavering, telling of her mistake, her son's survival, and the sea's mercy. Some spat at her, but others listened, their eyes softening as they remembered the brothers as children, laughing on the docks. The pendant at her chest glowed faintly, a reminder of her role in this fragile redemption. Alma, ever watchful, warned of the growing tension. The sea's power is strong, she said, her hands tracing the symbols on her walls. But it can't change a heart that's closed. She taught the brothers an ancient ritual, a way to call the sea's full strength if the time came. It'll cost you, she warned. The sea always takes something back. Elliot's jaw tightened, but Caleb nodded. Whatever it takes, he said. One night, a fire broke out at the edge of town, a shed owned by a family who'd supported the brothers. The flames were no accident. Pastor John's loyalists left a message scrawled in ash, "Sinners burn." The town gathered, some in fear, others in anger. Thomas rallied his allies, but the air was thick with dread. The brothers knew they couldn't wait any longer. They chose the town square for their stand, the same place where they'd faced the mob. At dawn, they walked hand in hand, their scars glowing, Margaret and Thomas at their side. The crowd gathered, drawn by whispers of a miracle. Pastor John was there, his face a mask of fury. But his followers were fewer now, their resolve weakened by the sea's signs. Caleb spoke, his voice carrying over the murmurs. "We're not here to fight," he said. "We're here to live, to love. The sea brought us back because it believes in us. Why can't you?" Elliot's light flared, not as a weapon, but as a beacon, illuminating the faces around them. Children gasped, elders wept, and even some of Pastor John's loyalists lowered their eyes. Margaret stepped forward, her voice trembling but clear. "I tried to destroy my sons because I was afraid. But fear isn't truth. Love is." She reached for Elliot, who hesitated, then took her hand. The crowd felt Ida shift, a crack in the wall of judgment. But Pastor John wouldn't yield. "This is a trick," he shouted, raising a torch. "They're demons." He lunged, but the sea's power surged, a wave of light that knocked him back. The crowd screamed, some running, others falling to their knees. Caleb and Elliot stood firm, their hands clasped, their light a shield. Thomas seized the moment, calling for peace. "Look at them," he shouted. "They're not hurting us. They're showing us a better way." The crowd began to split, some joining Thomas, others retreating with Pastor John. The town was at a crossroads, and the brothers knew this was only the beginning. As night fell, they returned to the cove, exhausted but unbroken. The heart of the tide pulsed, its light warm and approving. Caleb's latest vision showed a haven's inn transformed, its people united under the rainbow's glow. "It's possible," he whispered. Elliot pulled him close, his heart full. "Then we'll make it happen," he said. The final stand came on a morning when the sea was mirror calm, its surface reflecting a rainbow that stretched from horizon to horizon. Haven's end buzzed with tension, the town divided between those who saw the brothers as a miracle and those who saw them as a curse. Elliot and Caleb knew this was their moment. The sea's power had built to a crescendo, and their purpose was clear: to show the world that love could triumph over hate. They gathered with Margaret, Thomas, and Alma in the town square, the heart of the tide's light pulsing faintly in their scars. The crowd was larger now, drawn by stories of the brothers' miracles healing wounds, calming storms, guiding lost ships home. Even Pastor John's loyalists were there, their faces uncertain, their weapons lowered. Caleb spoke first. His voice, steady as the sea's hum, filled the air. We were born here, raised here, loved here. Our love isn't a sin, it's a gift. The sea saw that and brought us back. It's time for you to see it, too. Elliot stood beside him, his light flaring softly. A promise of protection. We're not asking for your approval, he said. We're asking for your humanity. Margaret took their hands, her pendant glowing. I failed my sons, she said, her voice raw. But I'm here now, and I'll fight for them. For all of you who've been told your love is wrong. Her words struck deep, and the crowd murmured, some stepping forward, others weeping. Pastor John emerged, his face gaunt, his faith shaken but stubborn. You twist God's will, he said, but his voice lacked its old fire. Caleb met his gaze. God made us, just as he made you. If the sea can love us, why can't you? The pastor faltered, his torch falling to the ground. Alma stepped forward, her hands raised, and the sea responded. A wave of light surged from the brothers, washing over the square, warm and alive. It touched every heart, softening fear, igniting hope. Children laughed, elders smiled, and even Pastor John sank to his knees, his face buried in his hands. The light showed them the coral city of Caleb's visions, a world where love was celebrated, not condemned. The town began to change. Families embraced those they'd shunned. Neighbors apologized, and the church opened its doors to all. Pastor John, humbled, stepped down, his sermons now of forgiveness and unity. Margaret worked tirelessly, rebuilding her bond with her sons. Her guilt a weight she carried but no longer let define her. Elliot and Caleb became the heart of Haven's End, their love a beacon that drew others to the sea. They taught the town to listen to its voice, to heal with its light. The cove became a place of pilgrimage, where people came to feel the heart of the tide's power, to find acceptance in its glow. Years later, Haven's End was unrecognizably a vibrant community where love, in all its forms, was celebrated. The brothers, now older, stood on the cliffs, their hands clasped, the sea whispering its approval. Margaret joined them, her smile weary but proud. You did it, she said. Elliot shook his head. We all did. The rainbow above burned bright, a symbol of their journey from a mother's desperate act to a miracle that defied nature's laws. The sea had chosen them, not just to survive, but to transform. And as they looked out at the horizon, they knew their love had changed the world, one heart at a time.